My name's Jack Reynolds, and my ranch has been standing on the southern ridge of Cottonwood County for 3 generations. It's not the biggest spread in Texas, not by a long shot, but every inch of dirt here carries my family's sweat and memory. My grandfather laid the first fence post himself. My father dug the old well by hand, and I've spent half my life keeping both alive. Around here, water isn't just a necessity, it's the heartbeat of the land. Most mornings start the same. The sun crawls over the low hills, the cattle stir, and the smell of mesquite drifts through the cool air. The only sound louder than the wind is the rhythm of the windmill squeaking as it draws water from the aquifer beneath our feet. I used to think that sound meant peace, but peace has a way of dying quietly, until the world reminds you how fragile it really is. It started with a letter. Thick envelope, glossy seal, and a tone so polite it almost hid the arrogance inside. "Dear Mr. Reynolds," it began, "the High Mesa Homeowners Association will be conducting maintenance on a community pipeline that passes near your southern boundary." Near. That word should have been my first red flag. I walk that line every season. The HOA's pipeline didn't pass near my land. It stopped 50 yards short of my fence. I called their office that same afternoon. A woman answered, her voice sharp and rehearsed. "Sir, our engineers confirmed that the easement gives us access." "Access to what?" I asked. "Because last I checked, the only thing your engineers are touching out here is my soil." She paused. "If there's a misunderstanding, we'll resolve it through proper channels." Proper channels. That's HOA speak for lawyers and stalling. I didn't think much more of it until a week later, when I heard engines on the south slope. I rode out on my ATV, dust kicking up behind me, and there they were. 3 trucks, a backhoe, and half a dozen men in safety vests. They had already cut a trench through the dry brush, a scar running straight across my boundary markers. I pulled up hard. "Hey, you're on private property!" A man in a hard hat turned, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. "Morning, sir. We've got authorization from High Mesa HOA to run maintenance on their line. You've also got authorization to trespass?" He smirked. "We're within the easement." "No, you're not." I stepped off the ATV and pointed to the old cedar post behind me. "That's my line. That trench you're digging is 30 yards past it." He shrugged like it didn't matter. "Take it up with the association, sir. We're just following orders." I wanted to argue, but I knew better than to yell at hired contractors. Instead, I took photos, every truck, every license plate, every inch of that trench. The air smelled of diesel and cut earth. As I stood there, I felt something twist in my gut. It wasn't anger yet, just a quiet warning, the kind that says, they're testing how far you'll bend before you break. That night, I spread the photos across my kitchen table. The lamplight flickered against them. Each image showed the same thing, a clean scar running across my land, straight toward the heart of my pasture. They weren't just laying pipe, they were stealing ground. I called the county records office the next morning. "I need a copy of all easements granted to High Mesa HOA, I told the clerk. She typed for a while, then said, "We've got one recorded 15 years ago. Stops at parcel 17B before the Reynolds property. Nothing beyond that." "No, sir. Your ranch is 17C. There's no extension, no amendment." That was all I needed to hear. When I drove back out that afternoon, the crew was gone, but the trench was deeper. The pipe already laid and the ground half covered. They were moving fast, too fast for it to be a mistake. I called the sheriff. "You got trespassers out here?" He asked. "I do," I said. "HOA contractors. They cut a line right across my land." He sighed. "Jack, you know how these things go." "If they've got papers, they don't," I snapped. "I just checked with the county. There's no easement, none." He hesitated. "I'll send a deputy to take a look." The deputy showed up an hour later, young guy, polite but uncertain. He took a few notes, asked a few questions, then said, "We'll file a report. Might take a while to process." By sunset, I knew what was happening. The HOA wasn't just stealing land, they were betting I wouldn't fight back. They thought I'd roll over like every homeowner they'd bullied before. But I wasn't one of their boardroom suits. I was born on this dirt, raised on it, and I knew the law of the land better than any of them. If you control the water, you control everything. That night, I pulled out the old land deeds, faded paper with my grandfather's signature still visible in blue ink. In 1963, he'd registered not just the ranch, but the water rights beneath it. Those rights had been passed down to me, and that meant every drop running through the aquifer under their shiny new pipeline still belonged to me. They'd built their line on my soil. They'd used my water, and they didn't even realize they'd just handed me the biggest leverage in Cottonwood County, so I decided to let them finish the job. Let them connect their line, fill their tanks, celebrate their little victory. Because when the time came, I was going to flip one valve, and the entire HOA would run dry. But revenge, I learned, needs patience. You can't fight fire with fury. You fight it with strategy. Over the next few weeks, I watched quietly. The HOA finished their work, paved over the scar, and installed a small maintenance shack right on my southern pasture. Every time I saw it, my jaw tightened. I started keeping notes: water flow, pressure levels, timing of their maintenance visits. Then one afternoon, I drove into town to meet with an old friend, Sarah Kendall, an attorney who'd grown up 2 ranches over. She'd left for Austin years ago, built herself a sharp reputation in land law. When I told her what happened, she leaned back, eyes narrowing. They crossed your boundary and tapped into your aquifer? Exactly, she exhaled slowly. Then they're not just trespassing, Jack. They're committing water theft. I raised an eyebrow. Water theft? Under Texas Water Code, paragraph 11-81, she said, flipping through her notes. It's illegal to divert or appropriate groundwater without the owner's consent. If you hold the rights, they're in violation. I smiled for the first time that week. So I can shut them off? Technically, yes, she said. But if you want to win, you need proof, documentation, and timing. Timing. That word stuck with me. When I left Sarah's office, I didn't head straight home. I drove to the supply store and bought new padlocks, gauges, and a pair of industrial shutoff valves. The man behind the counter didn't ask questions. Folks around here knew better. That night, I walked the line again. The moonlight spilled across the trench like a scar that refused to heal. I followed it to where their pipeline connected to the aquifer inlet, the one my father and I had drilled decades ago. Their connection was hidden beneath a metal grate, clean and professional, as if they owned it. I crouched down, running my hand over the soil. You made a mistake, I whispered. You thought this was yours. I installed the first valve right there, quietly, neatly, no trace left behind. Then I buried it, marked the spot with a single stone, and walked back to the house under the rising wind. They had no idea what was coming, and by the time they found out, it would be too late. The next morning I woke up before dawn. The world was quiet, painted silver by the last traces of moonlight. I could hear the faint hum of the pipeline, that dull metallic echo that now ran under my land like a parasite feeding off my veins. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring out the window toward the southern ridge. I wasn't angry anymore. That feeling had burned itself out. What I felt now was focus, cold, steady, unshakable. The kind a rancher gets before a storm, when you know you can't stop what's coming, but you can damn sure prepare for it. By mid-morning, I drove into town again. I stopped by the county clerk's office, requested certified copies of my water rights, and had them notarized. Then I visited Sarah, my lawyer friend, and handed her a folder with the documents. I want to make this official, I told her. If anyone asks who owns the water under High Mesa's line, I want the answer to be carved in stone. She smiled, impressed. You're playing this smart, Jack. They won't see it coming. I don't want them to, I said. Not yet, she leaned forward. What's your next move? I took a deep breath. I'm going to let them hang themselves. For the next few weeks, I watched. The HOA's new development, High Mesa Estates, was expanding faster than a wildfire in August. Rows of identical houses cropped up where there used to be open fields. Sprinklers hissed day and night, feeding green lawns that had no business being that green in Texas heat. I knew their system was pulling heavy from the aquifer, my aquifer. The gauges I installed near the main valve told me everything: flow rate, pressure, and most importantly, timing. Every day around 6 a.m., the HOA pumped water to fill their storage tanks. Every evening around 8 p.m., they drained again. Irrigation, pools, fountains, you name it. They were taking more than they could ever justify, and I was quietly collecting data, screenshots, and logs to prove it. Then came the HOA meeting. A friend of mine who lived in the development, Tom Jenkins, an old rodeo buddy, called me one evening. Jack, he said, his voice low, you might want to hear this. The HOA board's holding a meeting tomorrow night about the water bills. Folks are complaining. Complaining? I asked. Yeah. Prices went up 40% this month, and the board's blaming maintenance costs. But get this. They're saying the new line runs through county land. Didn't even mention your ranch, I smiled. Interesting. Thanks, Tom. That night I drove into High Mesa Estates. The place looked artificial, identical houses, manicured lawns, fences so white they looked painted by machines. The meeting was being held in the community center, a glass building that glowed like a lantern in the dark. I stood near the back, hat low, just listening. A man in a suit was speaking, Howard Nash, HOA president, the kind of guy who wears confidence like cologne. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice smooth as butter, our new water system has been a tremendous success. It's sustainable, efficient, and will serve the community for decades. A woman raised her hand. Then why are our water bills higher? Temporary adjustments, Nash said quickly. The system's still stabilizing. Once it's fully operational, rates will normalize. Lies, every word of it. I watched him gesture proudly toward a map behind him, a map that showed their new pipeline system. And there it was, bold and clear, a blue line cutting straight across my property, labeled HOA Utility Corridor. That was the moment something inside me clicked. They hadn't just stolen water. They'd rewritten the map as if I didn't exist. I walked out before the meeting ended. My hands were steady, my heart calm. The time for waiting was over. The next morning, I made my move. I started early, just after sunrise, when the air was cool and the birds hadn't started their noise yet. I drove down to the southern pasture, parked near the line, and walked to the buried valve. I brushed away the dirt, exposed the metal handle, and checked my pressure gauge one last time. The readings were high. They were mid-transfer, pumping thousands of gallons into their system. Perfect timing. I turned the valve 3/4 shut. Not all the way, just enough to choke the flow. The pressure would drop slowly, confusing their monitors. They'd think it was a leak, maybe air in the line. Nothing that screamed sabotage. Within hours, it worked. By noon, HOA maintenance trucks were parked all over the ridge. Workers scratched their heads, checked instruments, radioed back and forth. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee, pretending to care about nothing at all. By evening, the sprinklers at High Mesa Estates sputtered and died. Pools stopped refilling. Lawns started drying up. And just like that, the panic began. 2 days later, Nash showed up at my gate, black SUV, expensive suit. And that smug confidence that only comes from never having been told no in your life. Mr. Reynolds, he said, stepping out with a smile too wide to be genuine. Quite a place you have here. Yep, I said, leaning against the fence. Can I help you? He pulled out a folder. We're having a minor issue with our water pressure. Your property is near one of our lines, and I wanted to make sure there hasn't been any damage or accidental interference. I almost laughed. Accidental interference? You mean like accidentally building a pipeline across someone's land without permission? His smile faltered. I assure you everything was done within legal boundaries. I took a step closer. Funny, the county records say otherwise. You didn't just cross a boundary, you tapped into my aquifer. His jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation. So is trespassing. We stood there, silence thick as dust between us. Then I said, calm and steady, tell your engineers to stop pumping my water. You've got 48 hours before I cut you off completely. He scoffed. You wouldn't dare, I smiled. Try me. 2 days passed. They didn't stop. So I did exactly what I promised. At dawn, I went to the valve, twisted it all the way shut, and locked it with a heavy iron cap. No hesitation, no second thoughts. The line went silent. By that afternoon, every sprinkler in High Mesa Estates was bone dry. Pools half empty, fountains dead, lawns browning under the sun. I'd expected calls, threats, maybe a visit from a lawyer, but what I got was better. The local news ran a story that evening. Water crisis hits High Mesa. HOA faces backlash over supply failure. I stood on my porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky, and couldn't help but smile. They'd built their empire on stolen ground, and I'd just reminded them who really owned the source. But I knew this was only the beginning. They weren't going to back down quietly, and neither was I. The silence didn't last long. 2 days after I shut the valve, a courier dropped a thick envelope at my gate. Inside, A cease and desist order from the High Mesa Homeowners Association, signed by some high-dollar attorney out of Dallas. The words unauthorized interference with public utilities jumped off the page. Public utilities. I almost laughed. They were trying to turn my private well into a public service just because their greed ran dry. By noon, I was sitting across from Sarah, my attorney friend, in her office again. She skimmed the document, shook her head, and tossed it on the desk. "They're bluffing," she said. "They have no jurisdiction over your land, no easement, and no rights to that water." "Then let's call their bluff," I said, her lips curved into a grin. "Already ahead of you. Within 24 hours, we filed our own counterclaim. Unauthorized use of private groundwater, property trespass, and damages for unlawful resource extraction." It was official. War. The HOA's arrogance cracked fast once the news spread. The same local reporters who'd covered the water crisis came back with a follow-up headline: "Rancher claims HOA stole his water." The story blew up. Cameras outside my gate, microphones in my face, neighbors cheering me on from across the county. For the first time, High Mesa's perfect image was crumbling. Then their president, Howard Nash, tried to take control of the narrative. He went live on local TV, calling me a disgruntled landowner interfering with community infrastructure. I watched from my living room, coffee in hand. "Infrastructure?" I muttered. "More like theft with plumbing." That night, Sarah called. "They're pushing for an emergency injunction to force you to reopen the valve." "Let them," I said. "I've got something they don't." "What's that?" "Proof." The next morning, we walked into the county courthouse. The place buzzed with reporters. The judge, Evelyn Parks, was tough, mid-50s, sharp eyes, zero patience for drama. The HOA's lawyer started strong. "Your Honor, our clients represent over 200 homeowners whose daily lives have been disrupted by the defendant's unilateral actions." Sarah cut in. "Unilateral? My client merely secured his legally owned groundwater from unauthorized diversion." "We have documentation." The judge raised a hand. "Let's see it." Sarah laid out everything. The deeds, the 1963 water rights certificate, the county boundary maps, and photos of the HOA pipeline crossing Jack's fence line. The room went silent. The HOA lawyer fumbled, sweat breaking on his forehead. "Your Honor, even if that's true, the pipeline serves the public interest." Judge Parks leaned forward. "Public interest does not override private ownership, counselor. Unless you can produce a valid easement, you're trespassing," the man stammered. We're still locating the records." "Do that," the judge said coldly. "In the meantime, Mr. Reynolds' property rights stand." Case continued. Gavel drop. Boom. We walked out of that courthouse with cameras flashing and the HOA looking like they'd swallowed sand. By the next week, their situation turned desperate. The green lawns of High Mesa were yellowing fast. Residents were furious. People wanted answers. The HOA board held another emergency meeting. I didn't need to attend. The live feed was all over social media. Nash sat at the front, sweating under the fluorescent lights. A woman shouted from the back, "You told us the water came from the county." Another yelled, "You said everything was legal." Nash tried to smile. "We're handling it." "No, you're not." Someone screamed. "Our kids can't shower, our pools are empty, and you're blaming one man who owns the water you stole." That clip went viral. Suddenly, the mighty High Mesa HOA looked like fools who got outsmarted by one stubborn rancher with a well and a plan. But I wasn't done. A week later, we filed for injunctive relief to force the HOA to remove their pipeline and restore my land. The County Water Authority backed me after reviewing the data logs I'd collected, months of evidence showing their illegal drawdown. When I saw Nash again in court, his tone was different. Gone was the arrogance. He looked tired, cornered. "Mr. Reynolds," he said outside the courtroom, "maybe we can reach a settlement." "Maybe," I said. "But first you're going to fix what you broke." He nodded slowly. "And the water?" I smiled. "That's mine now. You'll buy it from me, at market rate." His jaw clenched, but he knew he had no choice. A month later, trucks rolled into my property again, only this time under my supervision. The HOA removed their illegal section of pipe, resealed the land, and reconnected legally through a new contract that made me the exclusive supplier. They were forced to sign a 20-year water purchase agreement at triple their old rate. The same people who thought they owned me were now paying me every month just to keep their lawns alive. The news ran one last headline. Rancher turns HOA's theft into profit. High Mesa. Forced to buy water from the man they crossed. I stood by my well that evening, the sunset glowing red across the horizon. The air was quiet again, peaceful the way it used to be. I didn't gloat. Didn't celebrate. I just turned the handle on the valve, felt the vibration of pressure returning through the pipe, and smiled. Because in the end, they learned the same lesson every man in this county knows. You can build your empire on someone else's land. But if you steal a rancher's water, you're already drowning. When the court orders were finally stamped and the last lawyer's handshake faded into memory, I went home and stood by the old oak tree near the well. It was quiet again, eerily quiet. The kind of silence you get after a storm tears through and leaves nothing but stillness behind. For months, I'd lived on adrenaline. Fighting, planning, calculating. Every day felt like a duel between me and the world. But now that it was over, I wasn't sure what to feel. Victory was supposed to taste sweet. Instead, it felt heavy. I kicked at the dirt, looking at the stretch of land where the pipeline used to run. The trench had been filled, the scars covered, but the earth still looked different, disturbed, like it remembered what had been done to it. Maybe that's how I looked too. That night I sat by the fire pit out back with a bottle of bourbon and a sky full of stars. The flames cracked, the air smelled of oak smoke, and the crickets carried on like the world hadn't changed. I thought about my grandfather, the man who built this place from nothing but grit and stubborn faith. He'd always said, "Water's the soul of the land, boy. Lose that and you lose everything." He was right. But he never said what happens when you fight to keep it and win, because winning isn't always clean. Sometimes it leaves you wondering if you've become part of the very thing you fought against. The HOA settlement had made me a wealthy man, at least on paper. Their 20-year water contract funneled a steady stream of money my way. Every month their payments arrived like clockwork. They didn't just buy my water. They bought their silence. But money never fixed what mattered most. Neighbors I'd known for years started treating me differently. Some called me a hero. Others called me ruthless. A few whispered that I'd gone too far. I didn't argue with them. Maybe they were right. The county offered to name me on a local water board. I declined. The last thing I wanted was to sit in meetings with men who thought fairness was just a matter of who had the thicker wallet. What I did instead was rebuild. I invested in new fencing, upgraded irrigation, and restored the old barn that had fallen into disrepair. I hired a few local boys, kids from families struggling after drought seasons. Taught them about wells, pumps, soil, and pride. Not the kind you show off, the kind you carry quiet inside you. One of those kids, Eli, reminded me of myself at 17, wide-eyed, stubborn, and full of questions. One evening while fixing a line, he asked, "Mr. Reynolds, why'd you fight those HOA folks so hard? You could have just sold the land and lived easy." I wiped the sweat from my brow and looked toward the horizon. "Because, son, if a man doesn't stand his ground once in a while, pretty soon he forgets what's his." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully get it yet. That kind of understanding only comes after you've been pushed to your edge and refused to break. A few months later, the season shifted. The rains came early that year, and for the first time in a long time, the riverbeds filled again. The land looked alive, green and stubborn. I took it as a sign that maybe things were healing in their own way. Then, one afternoon, I got a letter, not from the HOA, from a woman named Lydia Nash, Howard Nash's wife. She wrote, "Mr. Reynolds, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know what my husband did was wrong. The fight broke him more than he'll admit. I just wanted you to know that after the settlement, he resigned from the HOA. We sold our house and moved out of High Mesa. He says he sees your face every time he waters a plant. Maybe that's justice. Maybe it's guilt. Either way, you were right to fight." I folded the letter and set it down gently. For a long time, I just sat there thinking Howard had built his life on control, on power and ownership, and I'd stripped it all away, the same way he'd tried to strip mine. But the truth? I didn't hate the man anymore. I understood him. Because under all the arrogance, he was just another fool who thought the world could be owned instead of earned. Weeks turned into months. Life on the ranch settled into its old rhythm again. The cattle grazed, the wells hummed, the wind carried dust and memory. But something inside me had changed. Before all this, I'd thought of my land as mine. My right, my inheritance. Now I saw it differently. The ranch didn't belong to me any more than I belonged to the sky above it. I was just its caretaker for a little while, a man trusted not to ruin what time and nature had built. I realized that my fight with the HOA wasn't really about water or land. It was about respect, about the arrogance of people who think progress means domination. That thought sparked something in me. So instead of sitting on my victory, I used part of the settlement money to start a foundation, the Cottonwood Water Trust. It offered free legal aid to small landowners, farmers and families fighting corporate overreach, folks who couldn't afford lawyers like Sarah, folks like my grandfather, if he were still alive. When I told Sarah about it, she smiled wide. "That's the Jack Reynolds I know," she said. "Turn a grudge into a cause," I chuckled. Guess I finally learned something from all this. The years went by fast after that. High Mesa recovered, but it never quite got its shine back. They still bought their water from me, still paid their bills on time. Every check carried the same signature, High Mesa Community Association, authorized by a new president. I never cashed them myself anymore. The money went straight into the trust. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to fight the same fight. One autumn morning, I rode out before sunrise. The sky was a pale wash of purple, and the air smelled of cedar and dew. I stopped near the southern fence line, the same place where, years ago, they'd dug their first illegal trench. The grass had grown tall again, waving in the wind like the land was breathing easy. I dismounted, crouched, and pressed my hand into the soil. It was damp and cool. That's when it hit me. This was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not ownership, not vengeance, just the right to protect something pure. I closed my eyes and whispered, "We did it." "Grandpa." The wind answered with a soft rustle through the grass, and for the first time since the whole mess began, I felt peace. That night I sat on the porch with Eli. He was older now, tougher, and ran half the ranch with me. We watched lightning flicker far off over the plains, silent and distant. He said, "You ever regret what you did, Jack?" I thought for a long moment. "Sometimes," I admitted. But then I remember, if I hadn't done it, they'd still be taking what wasn't theirs. And maybe a little regret's a small price to pay for respect. He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "You think people like them ever learn?" "Maybe," I said. "But the land always remembers who listened and who didn't." We sat there quietly after that, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The cicadas sang. The stars burned cold, and I knew deep down that my fight, our fight, had meant something, not just for me. For everyone who ever got told to stand down when they knew they were right. Epilogue years later, after I was gone, people said my name like a story you tell around a fire. Some called me stubborn. Some said I was a legend. But truth is, I was just a man who refused to let anyone take what was sacred. The Cottonwood Water Trust kept growing. Farmers across the state used it to defend their rights. The next generation carried the torch without me, Eli among them. And on quiet mornings, when the wind blew across the southern ridge, the sound of the old windmill still turned above the aquifer, drawing water, drawing life, drawing legacy. Because long after men are gone, the land remembers who fought for it, and who just took from it. And that, I suppose, is enough.